Let's talk about power. What is it really? Where does it come from? And why does it always seem to just disappear? These are the questions that have basically defined human history. And today, we're going to connect the dots between a brilliant theory of power from all the way back in the 14th century and the rise of a really potent ideological movement that's shaping conflicts right now in the 21st century.
So let's just start with the biggest, most fundamental questions of all. Why do we even have governments in the first place? Why have rulers and states? And if they're so essential, why does history show us again and again that every single dynasty, every empire, every government eventually falls? All right, here's the game plan. First, we're going to look at the secret ingredient of power. Then, we'll trace its natural life cycle of boom and bust. After that, we'll jump to a modern ideology that tries to break that very cycle. We'll see it in action in Libya, and then we'll put it all together to compare these two very different models of power. To really get to the heart of how power works, we've got to travel back in time. We're going to the 14th century to meet one of history's greatest thinkers, a scholar named Ibn Khaldūn. He had this absolutely revolutionary idea about what really holds a society together. Okay, so for Ibn Khaldūn, government isn't just a nice idea, it's an absolute necessity. He basically believed that people, if you just leave them to their own devices, are driven by what he called injustice and aggressiveness. So without some kind of restraining force, a ruler, society would just tear itself apart, civilization would be totally impossible. And this brings us to his master concept, his big idea, ʿasabiyya. This right here is the secret ingredient. It's so much more than just teamwork or loyalty. It's this deep, almost primal sense of group solidarity. Think of it like a social superglue. It's what binds a group together so tightly that they're willing to fight and die for each other. And that is what gives them the collective power to dominate others and take control. For Ibn Khaldūn, ʿasabiyya is the engine that drives history. That's it. Real, lasting power doesn't come from money or royal bloodlines or a bunch of fancy laws. Nope. It comes from this raw collective will. A group with strong ʿasabiyya, often one that's been through some tough times together, becomes unified and strong enough to overthrow an old, complacent elite. But here's the brilliant twist in his theory. The second that group wins and sets up its own dynasty, a clock starts ticking. A clock that's counting down to its own destruction. Power is built, and then it always, always crumbles. Ibn Khaldūn saw this incredibly clear, predictable pattern, a life cycle that plays out over about 4 generations. First, you have the builder, full of that raw ʿasabiyya, who forges the dynasty. Their kid, the inheritor, still remembers the struggle and keeps it going. But then, by the 3rd generation, you get the imitator. They've grown up soft, comfortable, relying on tradition. And finally, you get the 4th generation, the destroyer. They've completely lost touch with what it took to build everything, and they just squander it all until the whole thing collapses. And this really gets to the core of why things fall apart. It's the success itself that dooms them. The luxury and comfort that power brings is exactly what erodes the group's strength. That toughness and unity forged in hardship just dissolves into softness and individualism. The ʿasabiyya is gone, and that leaves the dynasty wide open for the next hungry group with a stronger bond to come along. Okay, now let's hit fast forward about 700 years. We're going to leave that cyclical theory of power behind and look at a modern movement that offers a totally different model. This one isn't based on social bonds, but on a rigid, unchanging ideology. The Madkhali Salafis. At the absolute core of Madkhali Salafism is one incredibly powerful command. You must give absolute, unconditional obedience to the ruler. Their whole belief is that any kind of dissent, any protest, any political opposition at all inevitably leads to chaos and division, which they see as the ultimate evil. So, to keep order, the ruler must be obeyed, no matter what. To really get a handle on their ideological rigidity, one analysis makes this pretty striking comparison. It argues that Madkhalis and a group like ISIS are like 2 sides of the same coin. Now, hold on. This isn't about tactics or violence. It's about their methodology. While ISIS is extreme in takfir, that's kicking other Muslims out of the faith, Madkhalis are extreme in tabdi. They label any Muslim who disagrees with them as a dangerous innovator. The point is, both ideologies, despite different goals, work by demanding total conformity. They create division by drawing these hard lines in the sand. So what does this ideology actually look like when it gets real power? Let's ground this whole discussion in the real world.
specifically in the chaotic landscape of post-Gaddafi Libya, where Madkhali-aligned groups have become a major force.
According to a big report from the International Crisis Group, their rise has set off alarm bells all across Libyan society. Their influence isn't just some theory, you can feel it on the ground. The report calls out their intolerant actions and an anti-democratic agenda. So what does that mean in practice? Well, Madkhali-aligned militias have worked their way deep inside Libya's official security forces. And from that position of power, they've done things like crack down on public freedoms and support the destruction of historic Sufi holy sites that they consider to be heretical. They are using the power of the state to enforce their very specific and very rigid worldview. Okay, let's pull all these threads together. On one hand, we have Ibn Khaldun's dynamic, almost biological model of power rising and falling. And on the other, we have the Madkhali's static, ideological model of permanent, absolute obedience. Let's just break down the key differences here. For Ibn Khaldun, power is organic. It grows from the ground up through that social glue, ʿasabiyya. For the Madkhali ideology, power is a top-down command, based on a specific religious interpretation. So while Ibn Khaldun saw history as this natural cycle of rise and fall, the Madkhali ideology is trying to freeze that cycle. It demands absolute loyalty to preserve the status quo at all costs. So here's the bottom line. We are looking at two completely different ways of understanding power. One is a dynamic observation of how human societies actually work over time, this endless cycle of strength, ambition, decay, and renewal. The other is a static prescription for how societies should work, a rigid command to obey, always, to prevent chaos. And this leaves us with one last big question to think about. If Ibn Khaldun was right, if history really is this giant, constantly turning wheel of rising and falling powers, then what happens when a powerful ideology comes along and tries to jam a wrench in the gears and stop that wheel from turning? Can an ideology of permanent obedience actually defy the natural cycles of history?